NASA projects a surge in coastal flooding in the 2030s due to the moon wobble effect. Now, yesterday I posted another finding concerning the moon's wobble effect, that it will have an increase on stronger earthquakes on the Earth. Now we have been told that we have to expect coastal flooding as well. Brad Inspector Live Science reports on Science Alert. Climate change has already increased the frequency and severity of hurricanes and other extreme weather events around the world, but there's a smaller, less splashy threat on the horizon, and it could wreak havoc on America's coasts, actually all coasts. High tide floods, also called nuisance floods, occur in coastal areas when tides reach about 2 feet, or about 0.6 meters, above the daily average high tide, and begin to flood onto streets or seep through storm drains. And true to their nickname, these floods are more of a nuisance than an outright calamity, inundating streets and homes, forcing businesses to close and causing cesspools to overflow. But the longer they last, the more damage they can do. The U.S. experienced more than 600 of these floods in the year 2019, according to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA. But now a new study led by NASA warns that nuisance floods will become a much more frequent occurrence in the U.S. as soon as the 2030s, with a majority of the U.S. coastline expected to see 3 to 4 times as many high tide floods days each year for at least a decade. Kindly support my Patreon account since YouTube has again demonetized my YouTube channel. The daily posts are 5 videos daily, and they are totally different from what I have on my YouTube channel. Thank you so much for your support and that you find all my content so interesting. You'll find the Patreon account details in the description box below. The study, published June 21st in the journal Nature Climate Change, warns that these extra flood days will not be spread out evenly over the year, but are likely to cluster together over the span of just a few months. Coastal areas that now face just 2 or 3 floods a month may soon face dozens of floods a month or more. These prolonged coastal flood seasons will cause major disruptions to lives and livelihoods of communities. Don't start planning for them now, the researchers cautioned. They said it's the accumulated effect over time that will have an impact. Lead author Phil Thompson of the study said. He's an assistant professor at the University of Hawaii. He said if it floods 10 to 15 times a month, a business cannot keep operating with its parking lot underwater. People lose their jobs because they can't get to work. Seeping cesspools become a public health issue. Several factors drive this predicted increase in flood days. For one, there's a sea level rise. As global warming heats up the atmosphere, glacial ice is melting at a record pace, dumping enormous amounts of meltwater into the ocean. As a result, global average sea levels have risen about 8 to 9 inches since 1880, with about a third of that occurring in just the last 25 years, according to NOAA. But the year 2100s, by that year, sea levels could rise anywhere from 12 inches to 8.2 feet, above where they were in the year 2000, depending on how well humans restrict greenhouse gas emissions in the coming decades. Now, while rising sea levels alone will increase the frequency of high tide floods, they'll have a little help from the cosmos, specifically our moon. The moon influences the tides, as we know, but the power of the moon's pull is not equal from year to year. The moon actually has a wobble in its orbit, slightly altering its position relative to the Earth on a rhythmic 18.6-year cycle. For half of the cycle, the moon suppresses tides on Earth, resulting in lower high tides and higher low tides. For the other half of the cycle, tides are amplified with higher high tides and lower low tides, according to NASA. We are currently in the time amplifying part of the cycle, and the next tide amplifying cycle begins in the mid-2030s. And by then, global sea levels will have risen enough to make those higher than normal high tides particularly troublesome, researchers found. Through the combined effect of sea level rise and the lunar cycle, high tide flooding will increase rapidly across the entire U.S. coast, the team wrote. In a little more than a decade, high tide flooding will transition from a regional issue to a national issue, with the majority of U.S. coastlines being affected, the author said. Other elements of the climate cycle, like El Niño events, will cause these flood days to cluster in certain parts of the year, resulting in entire months of unrelenting coastal flooding. Scary as this pattern sounds, it's also important to understand for planning purposes. Understand that all your events are clustered in a particular month, or you might have severe flooding in the second half of the year than the first. That's useful information. Study co-author Ben Hamilton of NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory said in a statement. Extreme weather events may get all the national media attention as they batter America's coast, but high tide flooding will soon be impossible to ignore. So it's best to start planning now before it's too late, the author said. This is from Live Science on Science Alert. Please leave your comments and thank you for your support.